at those Gospels, those pages of the Gospels that are described as infancy narratives, the stories of Jesus, the stories leading up to his birth and after his birth, that are found in Matthew's Gospel, chapters 1 and 2, and much more extensively and differently in Luke's Gospel, chapters 1 to 2. And I think one of the things I would want to emphasize in relation to that material is I hope that we've been able together to begin to discover something of the richness of those stories. It's not simply about this happened and that happened and this person and that place. It's bringing out what we believe, what those early Christians believed about Jesus and his role and his identity. And when we come to the Gospel of John, which we're going to do now, we find that focus on what we might call theology, meaning, what we might call Christology, the study of the person of Christ, is even stronger. John doesn't tell us of events in the sense of a story of events. He tells us of one event, which we call the Incarnation. In other words, the taking flesh. The Word was made flesh and pitched his tent among us. The reason why we have to look at John chapter 1 is, as I've said earlier, that John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18, is the gospel at the main Mass, you might say, of Christmas Day, the day Mass of Christmas Day, the last of those three Masses that are provided, the night Mass, the dawn Mass, and now the day Mass. And it's quite intriguing that even the second reading at the day Mass is from the opening of the letter to the Hebrews, a rather obscure document of the New Testament, but one which contains gems. And Hebrews begins at various times in the past and in various different ways. God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets, but now he has spoken to us through his Son. In other words, you come to Mass at Christmas Day and you're being transported into some fundamental understandings of faith. And that's the way it should be. And of course, the greatest challenge and the most extensive challenge and the greatest gift in the scriptures for Christmas is this passage of the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. It begins, "In the beginning was the Word." And immediately we think, in the beginning, I know that. That's Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And John wants us to think in that way. He wants us to make that connection. In the beginning was Logos, the Word. And that's where we perhaps begin to struggle. What do we mean, the Word with a capital W? If you go to the first letter of John, chapter 1, you'll find the same use of the Word that we have heard and touched and seen. That Word brings life. So in the beginning, this Word was with God. The Word was in the beginning, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In other words, the Word shared what we might call divinity. Some people have translated this, what God was, the Word also was. Going back to Genesis, what is the first thing that God does? Genesis says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, but then it's going to tell you what God is supposed to have done at creation. And in verse 3 it says, God said, God spoke, and his first words were, let there be light. Genesis 1 verse 3. God gives a word, and there's perhaps some pointer to understanding. The Word was with God from the beginning. Some people have said, well, this is all about Greek philosophy and the Logos and all these ideas which come from contemporary culture to John. But in fact, you can find an explanation of a lot of this if you know the Old Testament, if you know the Hebrew Scriptures. In Proverbs chapter 8, the wisdom of God is there at creation, rejoicing at creation, assisting, as it were, God at the creation. And when we go to a very late book of the Old Testament, the book of the wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verse 1, by your word you made the universe, by your wisdom you established human beings. Very often we have references to wisdom as personified, the wisdom of God. Book of Proverbs, book of Sirach, the book of wisdom. And here there is a parallel between the wisdom and the word. Faith is gradually discovering more about God. And we have in those texts a preparation for our understanding of the Son as related to the Father. All of that will gradually lead us to the understanding of Trinity, a trinity of persons in the oneness of God. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Those are the first two verses of the prologue. And then, quite naturally, through him, through the Word, everything came into being. It's exactly what Genesis chapter 1 says. God spoke and things came into being. And not one thing came into being except through him. What has come into being in him was life. Now John will introduce us in these few verses to some huge concepts, some very important basic words. Words that you could stay with for a long time, reflecting on them. Logos, obviously, is one, the word. And now we have life. In him was life. All the way from the life that is given to creation to Christ who says, I've come that they should have life and have it to the full. This is one of the concepts that's used throughout John's Gospel and in the letters as well. In him was life, and that life was the light of all people. Life and light. A light that shines in the darkness, and darkness could not overpower it. So another huge concept, light. And light contrasted with darkness, and the darkness which threatens, the darkness which is going to overcome but cannot overcome the light of God. So there was life in the Word, And that life was the light of human beings. Then, as a bit of a rest from all this, we have the introduction in verse 6 of a man sent by God. His name was John. Now, this is not John who's writing, not John the evangelist, but of course John the Baptist. Each of the Gospels, very close to the beginning, usually in the first chapter, we have John the Baptist. Matthew's Gospel, you have to wait till chapter 3. But it's, if we think historically of the time of the adult Jesus, the first significant person there is John. And so the evangelist here introduces John. He came as a witness to speak for the light, so that everyone might believe. All these huge concepts are coming in. John is a witness. Just as Jesus will say to Pilate, I've come to bear witness to the truth. John comes to bear witness to the light of the word, so that everybody might believe. The purpose of all this reflection, all this preaching, is that you might believe. Remember the apostles of Jesus at Cana. He worked his first sign, and the disciples believed in him. So very early on in the gospel story of John, this concept of believing, of trusting the word, of knowing and trusting the word and relying on it. And then it says, John was not the light. He just came to bear witness to the light. Now later in chapter 1, when these scribes come from Jerusalem and say, who are you? What are you up to? He will say, I am not the Christ. I'm not the Messiah. I'm not Elijah who you expect to return. I'm not the prophet that Moses talked about. I am the voice crying in the wilderness. So even in verse 8, the evangelist John makes clear, John the Baptist was not the light. He came, however, to bear witness to the light. He was, as explained, chapter 3, I think, it was the friend of the bridegroom, who rejoices when the bridegroom comes. And going back, after that parenthesis about John the Baptist, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, as we know. But the world did not know him. The world did not know him. This is the concept which John has so often, of the world as the place where the truth of God is not accepted. Of course, it's also the place where the truth of God is discovered, gradually, slowly, painfully. But for John, the cosmos, the world, rejected him. And if it rejected him, it will reject you too. So we're very much in the real world. We're very much in those human situations where the darkness seems to overcome the light. But the light triumphs. And then something closer to home, verse 11. He came to, and the Revised New Jerusalem Bible says, he came to what was his own. He came to his own things, to his own place, to his own people. And his own people, did not accept him. Remember, Jesus says a prophet is never accepted in his own place. So he wasn't accepted by his own people. A suggestion there that John is aware that to a very great degree his own people, the chosen people, did not accept him. But there were those who did. And this is chapter 1, verse 12. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God. Children of God. A wonderful concept which John uses, tekna theou. He doesn't talk about sons of God, daughters of God. He talks about children of God. The Son of God is one. The children of God are many. And they are all those who believe in his name. The light comes into the world so that we might believe. John the Baptist bears witness to the light so that everyone might believe. And belief is the whole purpose of the gospel. Very end of chapter 20 of John. These things have been written down so that you may believe that this is Christ, the Son of God, and that believing this you may have life. So these wonderful concepts being introduced for the first time in chapter 1, which would be then recycled, which just shows us when we read the gospel, we need to be able to stop. We need to be able to pause with a word. And as we grow to love the scriptures more, that's what we'll want to do. One of my reputations, perhaps in my parish, is that I want the readers to slow down, to read slowly, because we need time. And when we're reading scripture, if we could just take a short passage and take time over it, and then to explore a word, it's a thing that those who read the scriptures and study the scriptures have been doing for centuries, to just explore a word and see how it is used, different contexts, different books. And there's so much in the Gospel of John, and it's not difficult. It's just a question of time and a prayerful approach. So to those who did accept him, he gave power to become children of God. That's what we become. We are reborn. Chapter 3 in Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus says, how can you be reborn? Do you have to go back into the womb? Jesus is talking about birth by water and Holy Spirit. The birth that comes to us through baptism and through the power of God. To those who did accept him, then, verse 12, he gave power to become children of God, to those who believed in his name, who were born not from blood, or from the will of the flesh, or from human will, but from God himself. Rebirth in God. At that point, we reach what is definitely the most momentous verse of this passage. And once upon a time, many years ago, every Mass celebrated would end with the reading of the Prologue of John. And at this point, the priest would genuflect. You have to be pretty old to remember that. It's the Mass before the Second Vatican Council. So we're going back to the 1950s. But that was read at every Mass. And at this point, the priest would genuflect. Just as in the Creed, we think of the Incarnation, that moment the Word became flesh and lived among us. The Word became flesh and lived among us, and we saw his glory. Glory as of an only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. So the Logos was with God from the beginning, always with God, becomes flesh, becomes human, the human life with all its vulnerabilities, with all its capacities. He becomes flesh and he lived among us. Actually, the Greek here says he pitched his tent among us. And that relates to a verse in the book of Sirach, a book called Ecclesiasticus, where God says to the law, make your tent in Jacob. The law is given to the people of Jacob, of Israel. Make your tent in Jacob. The Logos makes his tent among us. We translate as lived. Some people like dwelt, which is rather sort of archaic language. What it actually says is eskenosen. He made his tent within us, the divine presence among us. And we saw his glory. Glory, another huge concept. Glory, which is what God has and what God reveals. Go back to the stories of the Israelites going up Mount Sinai, chapter 34 of Exodus, chapter 24 of Exodus. And the glory of the Lord is revealed. And that glory, as of an only begotten Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. Now, if we're talking about huge concepts, you don't get any greater than grace and truth. Charis. Remember, Mary said to be graced, full of grace. And then truth, aletheia, full of grace and truth. Now these are concepts which go back to the Old Testament. The Hebrew word chesed, which means grace, yes, but it means fidelity, love, mercy. And then emet means truth, but it also means constancy, reliability. These are huge concepts. If you go to Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, a God of faithful love, that's hesed, that's charis. And constancy, that's emet, that's aletheia. These are huge concepts. So he is the one who brings us grace and truth. Then, as if this was all too much, once again, the evangelist points our attention to John the Baptist. John witnesses to him and cries out, saying, "This is the one of whom I said, he who comes after me has passed ahead of me because he was before me." John recognizes that this one who has come after him is greater than he is. Remember how he will say at one point, he must grow greater, I must grow smaller. I must be less, he must be more. And then the final verses of this great prologue. Verse 16. Indeed, says the evangelist, from his fullness, we have all received. Christ is the fullness. From his fullness we have all received. It's as if the chorus is coming. Yes, we have all received from his fullness. Grace upon grace. charim anti charitos. Grace upon grace. The whole history of human existence is a history of grace. And this is the greatest grace. And then he explains in verse 17, for the law was given through Moses. And that was a huge gift brought by angels. But grace and truth, there they are again, came through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth from God himself. The kindness, the love, the mercy, and then the truth, the constancy, the faithfulness of God. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. You cannot see God and survive. But the only begotten Son, the one who is in the Father's bosom, close to the Father's heart, who was with God from the beginning, his eternal Word, that one has made him known. So the only begotten Son, the only Son of God, has made him known. Ekenos exegesator. He has explained him, he has unpacked him, he's made him knowable and even seeable. Now when we think of what John chapter 1 is saying, the Word was made flesh, you can see how it relates to the child in the manger, to the child who is greeted by those magi from far off lands, to the child who is received by Simeon in the temple and described as the light of the world. He has made God known. Why is Christmas so important to us? Because this is, in a way, the whole story. God is known to us as light and life and goodness and mercy and forgiveness. All those things. And that story will be explained as we go through those chapters of whatever gospel we read. And in the end we find the gift of Christ, even unto death, and the new life given to Christ in the resurrection. I hope that we can, and maybe not this year, maybe next year, maybe year by year, continue to explore these wonderful Christmas Gospels. Maybe it's just reading them simply, maybe it's taking a passage, reading for one day, maybe it's taking a sentence or even a word. Whether it's John, whether it's Matthew and Luke, whether it's Mark. We've been given a great gift in these Gospels. And at Christmas, I think, as we pass through our different years, and as we come to Christmas once more, we can perhaps discover more deeply and love more fully the mystery that we celebrate at this time. Thank you very much.
Dominus